Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Tonight we're diving into the reasons why Alpharius became a traitor Primarch. Before we get into madness, be sure to like and comment in the videos and topics to see the future. Sure to subscribe for the Emperor or the Dark Gods. I want to thank you guys for supporting me, killing it. Now, let's get into the madness.
The fastest way to misunderstand Alpharius is to take the word traitor at face value. That is the first snare. That is the first poisoned blade hidden beneath the velvet of imperial memory. The Imperium has always loved a clean verdict, a useful blasphemy, a name that can be spat from the lips of preachers and carved into the walls of fortress chapels in letters of sanctified hate. Traitor, heretic, arch-deceiver. Such words are not merely judgments in the Imperium of man. They are weapons. They are absolutions granted to the victors. They are the iron nails by which history is pinned to the corpse of truth until it can no longer squirm. And yet there are some names that refuse the nail. Alpharius is one of them. To hear the chronicle mongers of terror tell it, the matter is simple. The Alpha Legion stood with Horus. The hydra bared its many fangs against the throne. Its warriors slit loyal throats in the dark, sabotaged bastions, poisoned supply lines, broke compliance worlds from within, and cast entire populations into panic and countermand before the first bolter round was even chambered. This much is true. Entire fleets burned because the 22nd Legion had walked among them first. Entire regiments butchered one another because an Alpha Legion operative had seeded the right order into the right Vox channel at the right hour. Governors died screaming beneath poison needles. Astropaths clawed out their own eyes in chambers full of incense and blood. Battle lines dissolved into hysteria because men no longer knew which banner they served or which command voice was genuine. Wherever the hydra went, certainty died first. So let no fool mistake this for absolution. If there was loyalty in Alpharius, it was not the shining, knightly, banner-born loyalty of the Remembrancer myth. It was not the noble, open devotion that lesser minds crave when they speak of honor. If he remained loyal at all, then his was the kind of loyalty that would poison a city to save a sector. The kind that would watch 1 billion souls burn if the arithmetic of extinction demanded it. The kind of loyalty that ceases to resemble virtue the moment it enters real space. In the age of the Imperium, and more so in the furnace years of the Horus heresy, there were no clean hands among the Emperor's sons. There were only degrees of damnation, each one wrapped in a different heraldry. That is why the title is a lie. Not because Alpharius did not stand against the Emperor in deed. He did. Not because Alpha Legion blades did not open loyalist throats from Istvan to the threshold of terror. They did. Not because the record is false in every particular. It is not. The lie runs deeper than that. The lie is the comforting belief that visible treason and inward allegiance must always be the same thing. The lie is the childish conviction that a Primarch as unknowable as Alpharius could be measured by the same standards as Angron in his rage, or Fulgrim in his corruption, or Lorgar in his kneeling hunger for gods. The lie is that the Hydra can be understood by looking only at the corpse it leaves behind. With Alpharius, identity itself is compromised before the first shot of the heresy is ever fired. Before one legionary dies in the black mud of a compliance war, before one oath of rebellion is hissed across a strategium deck, before the War Master's rebellion becomes a wound so deep the species never stops bleeding from it. The Alpha Legion is already unlike the others. Its methods are hidden war, false sigils, mimicry, embedded operatives, sabotage, severed communications, and victory achieved through confusion so complete that the defeated do not know by whose hand they were ruined. The Legion does not merely employ deception, it consecrates it. It does not simply lie. It builds cathedrals from lies and dwells inside them like a priesthood. Then comes the deeper blasphemy. Alpharius is not singular. That statement alone should have been enough to condemn every surviving record to suspicion. Yet the Imperium, in its tireless hunger for rigid forms and complete doctrines, still tries to force the Alpha Legion into a shape it can punish. Alpharius and Omegon, twin Primarchs, 2 bodies and 1 soul by their own accounting, were presented to the wider Imperium as one being, one name, one public face, one master of the 20 Legion, one hydra head held up for other legions to regard with distrust. Whether the Emperor knew the full truth from the beginning, or whether even that secret came as a surprise later hardly matters now. What matters is that the Twinhood existed, and that once it is admitted into evidence, every accusation becomes unstable. Who gave the order? Who stood in the chamber? Who spoke to Horus? Who met with Xenos seers in the dark between stars? Who intended betrayal? Who intended sabotage? Who died? Who survived? The questions pile up like skulls. If a Primarch can appear in 2 places through means both literal and theatrical, if Legion officers can wear his face and his name, if one brother can speak for the other, while both insist they are a single will divided only by flesh, then all memory curdles, testimony rots, battlefield reports become devotional icons rather than evidence. What one survivor swears by the throne he saw may have been misdirection. What another recorded in the bloodlogs of a void battle may have been engineered for later discovery. Even the Primarch's own account is haunted by deliberate untruth. With Alpharius, the archive is a crime scene that has been swept clean by the murderer and then repainted to resemble a shrine. This is not a flaw in the subject, it is the subject. The Alpha Legion does not merely hide truth, it weaponizes the hunger for it. So when lesser historians ask whether Alpharius was loyal or traitor, they reveal at once that they have not yet understood the first principle of the hydra. He could be both in appearance and neither in essence. He could wear treason as a cloak and loyalty as a wound beneath the plate. He could stand with Horus on one day, move against Horus on another, and still believe that in both moments he served a purpose beyond the comprehension of brothers, more straightforward and therefore more easily damned. A legion bred for overt glory wages war in banners, charges and declarations. A legion bred for hidden war wages it in masks, layers and outcomes. Alpharius was never likely to ask what a thing looked like. He was always more likely to ask what it achieved. And that is where the true horror begins. Because if Alpharius did not betray the Emperor out of faithlessness, then what did he betray him for? Not love, not pride, not wounded vanity, not the hot and simple seductions that dragged other Primarchs toward the abyss. No, the possibility that clings to the Alpha Legion like grave mist is worse than that. Far worse. It is the possibility of catastrophic strategic logic. It is the possibility that Alpharius looked upon the coming civil war and accepted the appearance of treason as the price of a greater form of loyalty. Not loyalty to the Imperium as it stood, perhaps. Not loyalty to the institutions of terror, nor to the pomp of compliance, nor even to the dream of a unified mankind in its polished crusade form. Something colder, something wider. Loyalty to a future so blood-drowned and abstract that only a mind like his could still call it duty. Such a choice would not redeem him. Understand that and carve it into your thoughts with a combat knife. There is a childish sickness in some corners of imperial and renegade memory alike, a hunger to turn every complicated figure into a martyr or a monster and be done with the discomfort. But the Alpha Legion offers no such comfort. If Alpharius remained loyal in intent, then he remained loyal in the worst possible way. The way of sealed orders and disposable populations. The way of false flag massacres, engineered, rebellions, severed vox arrays, infiltrated command echelons, and allies manipulated like game pieces upon a hololithic board wet with blood. The Hydra's methods are monstrous, whether they serve terror or revolt against it. A population shot by its own defenders because the Alpha Legion turned command channels against themselves is no less dead because some hidden thesis of salvation was being served. A regiment driven into fratricide by forged orders is no less damned because a Primarch judged it necessary. Brains still burst across Ferrocrete. Entrails still steam in shell craters. Men still drown in their own blood, while Medici servitors step over them in search of officers worth preserving. Loyalty does not make the grave shallower. That is the nature of this galaxy. Truth in the age of the Imperium is seldom a whole thing. It arrives torn, sanctified, revised, mistranslated, half-burned, or recited by witnesses who profited from the lie. It is folded into myth, processed into catechism, set behind stained glass and censor wax, or buried in the private vaults of inquisitors who die before they can decide whether to reveal it. Even among the Astartes, who remember with machine precision and hate with monastic dedication, truth does not escape unscarred. It becomes symbol, ritual, vengeance, prophecy. A battle is remembered not as it was fought, but as the chapter or legion requires it to have meant. The dead are polished into exemplars. The defeated are flattened into warnings. Whole campaigns become a single slogan. Whole betrayals become a single name. Traitor. But Alpharius resists flattening. The word does not fit cleanly because the man beneath it was already fractured by design, by secrecy, by twinhood, by method, by his legion's devotion to masks, and perhaps by a strategic burden no other Primarch would have accepted without calling it damnation. That is why one cannot judge him by asking whether he looked loyal. Of course he did not. He looked like every fear the Imperium ever held about hidden knives. He looked like treachery in scale armor. He looked like the unseen hand at the back of every failed defense and every sudden mutiny. He looked, in short, exactly as he needed to look if he meant to disappear inside the role history would later assign him. The question is not whether Alpharius appeared to betray the Emperor. The question is whether he believed he was still serving something higher than open allegiance. A grand design, a colder necessity, a future bought with infamy, the salvation of mankind through methods that would make mankind itself recoil, perhaps even obedience to a logic so pitiless that to enact it was already to become a monster. That is the poison at the heart of the Hydra. The same act can be rebellion, sabotage, camouflage, and duty, depending on which head is speaking and which corpse is being counted. The same blade can murder a loyal servant, sever a rotten limb, or carve a path towards some larger victory no one present will survive to understand. In such a war, labels are for the comfort of the dead. So remember this as we go deeper into the shadowed archives of the 20th Legion, into the lies told by Primarchs, by legionaries, by Imperial chroniclers, by Xenos whisperers, by survivors who glimpsed only one battlefield from a war fought across 10,000 masks. Alpharius did indeed become a traitor in history. The more terrible possibility is that he did so in order to remain loyal in intent. The twin mystery is not a flourish added to the Alpha Legion after the fact. It is not some decorative scrap of obscurity stitched over an otherwise simple betrayal. It is the black heart of the whole hydra. Tear it out, and the Legion ceases to make sense. Leave it where it belongs, and every neat verdict ever passed upon Alpharius begins to bleed through the parchment. This is the truth that lesser chroniclers fear, because the Imperium can endure monsters, rebels, and heresiarchs far more easily than it can endure uncertainty. It can build a feast of sermons around a beast it understands. It can forge martyr cults and execution litanies around a rebel whose sin has a stable shape. But what does an empire of dogma do when the accused was not one being in the way other men are one being? What does judgment even mean when the name in the indictment belongs to more than one soul wearing more than one face? That is the first wound the Alpha Legion opens in the body of history. Alpharius Omegon was never merely a name. It was a device, a seal, a veil drawn across the eyes of allies and enemies alike, a command cipher written in flesh. Those outside the Legion spoke of Alpharius as though he were a singular Primarch, because that was the lie they were meant to swallow. One gene father, one will, one master of the 20th. Even this alone would have been enough to breed suspicion, for Alpharius did not conduct war as his brothers did. He did not crave the public theatre of conquest. He did not require the clean blaze of banners or the adoration of armies who saw their demigods stride among them in full sight. He moved behind events rather than through them. He preferred the hand on the throat to the fist raised in challenge. But the deeper truth was fouler than mere secrecy. The wider Imperium did not know it looked upon one public mask worn by twin Primarchs. One legend, two bodies. One hydra head shown to the galaxy while the other remained in shadow. Once that truth is admitted, Alpharius ceases to be a single man in the common sense and becomes something colder and more sophisticated. A distributed identity, a mind divided across flesh, but unified in purpose, or at least unified enough to function as a single weapon. The question is not simply whether Alpharius and Omegon shared a name. That is the shallow edge of the blade. The deeper edge is that the Legion itself was trained to inhabit that name. It became liturgy within the 20th. It became doctrine. Not only could the Primarch be two, but the Legion learned to act as extensions of him, fragments of his authority, echoes of his image moving through the chain of command like venom through blood. The phrase itself spread like a creed and a contagion. I am Alpharius. A boast, a joke, a mask, a warding charm against certainty. Every time it was spoken, identity was smeared a little further across the inside of the Legion until the man and the office and the lie could scarcely be separated. That is why impersonation within the Alpha Legion was not some emergency stratagem reserved for rare operations. It was normalized. It was built into the marrow of their way of war. Other legions had decoys, body doubles, false beacon trails, encrypted command relays. The Alpha Legion had something far more profane. It cultivated substitution as a habit of existence. Officers stepped into one another's roles without hesitation. Orders moved through hidden strata of command. Armor marks were altered. Heraldry was shifted. Voices were imitated. Chains of obedience were obscured until no outside observer could be wholly certain where the true command node lay. Even within the Legion, that uncertainty was part of the point. A force that can lose its visible head without losing direction is already more difficult to kill. A force that trains its warriors to obey the plan more than the person is halfway toward immortality. And then came the cruel perfection of it. There were Legion officers who could appear as Alpharius to those permitted to see no deeper. There were captains, lieutenants, chosen instruments of the Primarch's design, who could stand before allies or prey in scaled plate, helm crests and proportions engineered for recognition and be taken for the Gene Sire himself. This was not an incidental confusion. It was an operational condition. The Legion did not merely tolerate it, it fed upon it. What one enemy fleet reported as Alpharius boarding a station might have been a senior commander. What one remembrancer swore he saw in a strategium chamber could have been one of the twins, or neither, or a carefully arranged apparition meant to produce exactly such testimony. In another Legion, eyewitnesses strengthen the chain of evidence. In the Alpha Legion, eyewitnesses are often the first casualties. This is why motive becomes so much harder to pin down here than with any other Primarch. With Angron, rage scorches the page. With Fulgrim, pride and corruption gleam through every wound. With Mortarion, resentment and endurance harden into poison. Even where motives are layered, the visible soul of each rebellion leaves a stain that can be read. But the Alpha Legion does not stain in one color. It refracts. It splits intent into masks and masks into operations. If a world is subverted, was that done in service to Horus, in spite of Horus, in accordance with a wider calculus, or as part of a chain whose final object lay elsewhere entirely? If a convoy is spared, if a Vox network is severed, if one commander is assassinated while another is left breathing, the question cannot be answered by asking only who was present. Presence is almost meaningless within the hydra. One must ask who authored the layer beneath the visible act, whose design was advanced, whose hand benefited from the confusion, whose future required the present lie. That is why so many clean moral readings of the Alpha Legion are born dead. They are attempts to force a blade of manifold edges into a simple sheath. Some will insist the Legion must have been wholly traitor because it fought on the traitor side and spilled loyalist blood. This is the comfort of the execution block, where visible crime is taken as the whole of intent. Others, drunk on contrarian appetites, strain to cast the Legion as secret saviors, hidden loyalists untouched by the stain that blackened their brothers. This is another comforting lie, no less, childish for being more flattering. The Alpha Legion does not fit either hunger. If there was loyalty in it, the loyalty was blackened by deeds that would damn any lesser soul. If there was treason in it, that treason may at times have moved according to a logic that did not align cleanly with the triumph of Horus. That is what makes the Legion worthy of this age. It is not clean enough to love, and not simple enough to hate without qualification. Even the records that seem most official do not rescue us. Indeed, they often mock us. In another archive, one expects the seal of authority to promise clarity. In the matter of Alpharius, official-looking testimony arrives with poison in its mouth. The record itself warns of deceit. The account bears the scent of deliberate falsehood even before one begins to peel it open. That should terrify any serious student of the heresy more than 100 battlefield contradictions. If the Primarch's own presented chronicle is fashioned with layers of misdirection, then the archive is not a sanctuary from the Legion. It is one of its battlefields. Ink becomes another theatre of war. Memory itself is sabotaged. The administratum clerk, the remembrancer, the savant, the inquisitor, the princeps of a campaign engine all become delayed participants in a stratagem launched centuries before they were born. And so the curse of the twins reveals itself. Their unity was their greatest strength, but it was also the source of a doom no other Primarch could fully share. When one acted, both were implicated. When one lied, both names were dirtied. When one took a risk, both disappeared deeper into the mask. even if one brother had wished to stand cleanly in the light and the other to vanish into the necessary filth of clandestine war, the galaxy would not have granted them separate judgments. They had already chosen oneness as a method. That oneness made them formidable because it allowed the Legion to move with a depth of deception no rival could equal. But it also condemned them to mutual contamination. The brother in the dark stained the brother in the light. The brother at council stained the brother in ambush. To be two and be treated as one is power. To be two and judged as one is damnation. This is where the lesser debate often loses itself in trivia. Was it Alpharius or Omegon? Which twin stood on which deck? Which one spoke to this emissary? Which one died under that blade? Which one remained to bear the name afterward? Such questions have their place, and yet by themselves they can become another kind of blindness. The more important question is not always which body stood in the chamber. The more important question is whose plan was being served. A twin Primarch system is not merely a riddle of identity, it is a machine for strategic depth. The body in the room may matter less than the unseen architect behind the visible move. The Alpha Legion knows this. That is why it wants the investigator lost in the mirror maze of names and faces while the true line of intent slips past unmarked. To obsess only over whether it was Alpharius or Omegon is to let the hydra choose the battlefield of interpretation and win before the first return shot is fired. And let it be said again, because the temptation to romanticize this legion is a disease among the unwary. None of this softens what the Alpha Legion did. It infiltrated. It deceived. It engineered revolt. It turned comrades into unwitting executioners. It collapsed trust inside fleets, armies, and whole compliance structures. It made war not only upon bodies but upon certainty itself. Men died screaming because they obeyed the wrong code phrase from the wrong mouth. Companies vanished because their route orders had been rewritten by hands wearing friendly sigils. Planetary governors were manipulated into purges that drowned hive levels in blood before the first true invasion wave ever landed. Brains burst under suppressor rounds in silent corridors. Guts spilled across strategium steps when the supposed bodyguard revealed his chain blade beneath a false oath. Whole commands tore themselves apart, trying to determine which voice on the Vox was genuine. There is nothing noble in such methods, merely because they are intricate. Monstrosity remains monstrosity, even when executed with elegance. Yet that same monstrosity is why we must resist easy readings. The Alpha Legion was built to function where morals are least visible and consequences most delayed. It is the legion of hidden causality. Therefore, any judgment that arrives too quickly is probably already compromised. This is true of the loyalist reading and the traitor reading alike. The clean answer is almost certainly the false one. The pure condemnation is too neat. The pure exoneration is too neat. The hydra does not permit neatness. It devours it. The moment a scholar, a preacher, or a war sage thinks he has found a simple moral shape inside Alpha Legion history, that is the moment he should check his own shadow for a knife. Because before we judge treason, before we pronounce on loyalty, before we crown one twin damned and the other redeemed, we must first accept the most unsettling possibility of all. The man we are judging may not have been singular in the first place. Before the galaxy learned to fear the hydra in full, before the war of brother against brother split the heavens and turned the dream of unity into a feast for carrion things, Alpharius had already been shaped for a different kind of conquest. The Great Crusade loved spectacle because spectacle reassured those who witnessed it. The hosts of the Emperor descended in fire and thunder. Titans walked. Fleets blotted out constellations. Primarchs strode at the head of their sons, like figures cut from the oldest myths of old Earth and cast anew in ceramite, gene-forged sinew, and relentless purpose. Compliance often came with banners raised high enough for the frightened and the conquered to see exactly who had mastered them. That was how the crusade justified itself to those who needed beauty painted across slaughter. It preferred victory that could be sung. But not every son of the emperor was made for songs. Some were made for the silence before the killing began. Alpharius belonged to that silence. There were brothers who broke worlds by naked force and almost seemed to revel in the honesty of it. Russ came like a winter execution with fangs bared and axes wet. The lion was the deep forest made flesh, predatory and severe, a hunter prince who struck with the aristocratic violence of ancient beasts. Guilliman mastered by order, by weight of administration, by the certainty that his empire-making mind could impose structure upon any chaos that dared defy him. Dawn built and broke in the plain language of stone, geometry, and unyielding will. Sanguinius conquered by radiance as much as by blade, and even those he slew could imagine they had been defeated by something terrible and sublime. Horus, in the days before his ruin, wore command like a second skin and bent whole theatres of war around his charisma. Each of them fought in a way that made sense to those who watched. Even when they were feared, they were legible. Alpharius was not. He was the Primarch built for the hidden war. Not merely skilled in it, not merely willing to employ it when the field demanded ugly measures, but formed at the level of instinct for infiltration, sabotage, falsehood, severed communications, compromised command structures, and the deliberate cultivation of controlled disorder. Where another Primarch might see a hostile world and think first of where to land the main assault, Alpharius would ask who supplied its orbital guns, who had grievances in its officer caste, which data shrines held the transit ciphers, which underhive syndicates could be turned, which astropathic relays could be blinded, which water guilds could be poisoned with rumor before poison ever touched their reservoirs. He did not look at a battlefield and see only armies. He saw systems. He saw dependencies. He saw chains of consequence waiting to be broken link by link until the enemy collapsed beneath the weight of its own unraveling. This is important to understand because secrecy in those years was not yet corruption. Too many look back from the long nightmare of the heresy and assume that all concealment was already a seed of betrayal. That is the luxury of hindsight, and hindsight is among the most deceitful luxuries in the Imperium. Before Horus tore open the wound that never closed, the Great Crusade still allowed room for many kinds of war. Some legions were made to batter bastions into rubble, some to pacify, to govern, to inspire, to terrify, to endure, to hunt. The Alpha Legion's way of war was secretive, because that was its nature, not because it had already crawled toward damnation. The Hydra was not born corrupted, it was born oblique. Yet, men mistrust what they cannot easily witness, and the other legions were still men beneath all their gene-wrought grandeur. Even before the heresy sharpened every old suspicion into something lethal, the methods of the Alpha Legion alienated them. A victory won by infiltration rather than open contest left a sour taste in the mouths of warriors who measured honor by visibility. A campaign ended by internal collapse rather than glorious assault could look almost bloodless from orbit and still feel unclean to those who preferred their righteousness broadcast from the muzzles of bolters. The 20th would break a world by whispers, forged directives, severed supply arteries, vanished magistrates, and carefully placed assassinations. Then it would descend upon a foe already half strangled and present the result as conquest. Effective, efficient, entirely in keeping with imperial expansion. And yet many of their cousins in the Legiones Astartes looked upon such work and saw something fundamentally suspect, as though war that moved in shadow must already owe fealty to shadow. That suspicion mattered, not because it proved the Alpha Legion false, but because it meant Alpharius learned very early that service did not require comprehension from his brothers. He did not need to be admired in order to win. He did not need to be celebrated in order to be useful. He could accept distrust as operational weather. Where another Primarch might bristle beneath insult, might seek the vindication of visible triumph, Alpharius could fold contempt into the campaign and proceed. That capacity is more dangerous than simple patience. It means a commander can continue moving toward his objective, even while every witness misreads him. In some theaters, that is a strength beyond price. In others, it is the beginning of spiritual ruin, because Alpharius thought in outcomes, not appearances, in structures, not emblems, in the final state of the war, not in the heraldic cleanliness of the path taken to reach it. That does not make him uniquely wicked among the Primarchs. Many of the Emperor's sons committed horrors in the name of unity. Many drowned worlds in blood and called it necessity. But some still required that necessity wear a recognizable face. Some needed the language of honor, compliance, justice, or vengeance to remain visible upon the act. Alpharius required no such dressing. He could live with dirty necessity if he believed it served the end state. He could sanction subterfuge, contamination, false surrender, and weaponize panic, because to him, these were not moral deviations from war. They were forms of war. Another Primarch might say that a tainted victory poisoned the thing it preserved. Alpharius might answer that an undefended principle is just another way to lose, and that is where the trap begins to reveal its shape. A mind like that is formidable. It is also uniquely vulnerable to grand strategic deception. Not the crude lure of personal gratification, not the simple seductions that swallowed weaker or more wounded souls, but the higher poison, the poison of scale, the poison that says the visible evil is bearable because it prevents the invisible catastrophe, the poison that asks not what a deed is, but what larger doom it averts. Such arguments fall most readily upon those who think in systems. If a commander lives in webs of cause and effect, if he measures campaigns by long consequence rather than local purity, then he can be led into horrors by an enemy clever enough to frame those horrors as the least ruinous option. The more vast the board becomes, the easier it is to justify sacrificing pieces. The wider the timeline, the more comfortable monstrous arithmetic begins to feel. This is why Alpharius may have been the Primarch most likely to accept contamination as camouflage. Another brother might recoil from an order that required his legion to look damned in the eyes of all honest witnesses. Another might refuse on principle, or pride, or simple revulsion at the stain. Alpharius could instead ask whether looking damned was useful, whether being mistaken for a traitor purchased access unavailable to the openly loyal, whether hatred from allies was tactically survivable if it enabled him to move unseen inside a greater fire. This is not nobility. It is not some hidden chivalry concealed beneath the scales of the hydra. It is a far more dangerous form of devotion, one stripped of the need to seem pure. A warrior who must look righteous can sometimes be predicted. A warrior willing to look fallen so long as the plan advances becomes vastly harder to measure. That is why the Emperor's design casts such a long and troubling shadow here. For what sort of father makes such a son? What sort of master forges a Primarch whose greatest gift is to vanish inside ambiguity? It is tempting to imagine that the emperor, in all his pitiless genius, wanted every mode of conquest embodied among his sons. The obvious war, the righteous war, the punitive war, the inspirational war, the attritional war, the hidden war. If that is true, then Alpharius was not an error, but an instrument crafted for the cracks between the grand triumphs, for the campaigns where open banners would fail, and only infiltration could prepare the kill. Yet such a creation bears within it a terrible implication. A weapon forged to serve through ambiguity may one day have no other way to serve. He may only know how to be useful by stepping where trust cannot follow. And how then is such a son judged? A Primarch like Dawn can be hated and still stand plain before the galaxy, his defiance visible, his duty unmistakable. Russ can be feared, even despised, and still remain fundamentally readable as the Emperor's executioner. Guilliman can be resented as an empire builder, and yet never disappear into uncertainty. But Alpharius exists in another register. His strengths ensure that the more effectively he serves, the less comprehensible his service may appear. Every successful hidden action erodes witness. Every triumph of secrecy destroys evidence. Every necessary lie breeds 10 more accusations. The better he does the work for which he was made, the easier it becomes for history to mark him as false. This does not excuse the Alpha Legion's cruelties. Their victories were often paved with the bodies of those who never understood why they were dying. There were worlds where panic killed more surely than bolt shells, because the Legion had sabotaged trust itself before the invasion ever began. There were defenders who shot their own brothers in dim corridors, because command ciphers had been altered by unseen hands. There were governors who purged entire populations on forged intelligence, and then fell to Alpha Legion blades once the labor was done. Guts steamed in manufactorum aisles, while false compliance envoys walked over the dead. Brains painted command thrones because a signal that should have meant hold position had been twisted to mean advance into enfilade fire. This was not the clean artifice of game boards and hollow maps. It was meat, terror, and the collapse of all certainty. Yet Alpharius could still have believed such methods were service. That is the key. Service not to appearances, not to the vanity of being recognized as righteous, but to whatever final objective he had accepted as binding. If he was offered a vision of war vast enough, a calculus severe enough, then he was perhaps the one Primarch most prepared to carry infamy as if it were merely another weapon. He could endure being named Deceiver. He could endure being whispered about in strategium halls. He could endure brothers distrusting his victories and commanders recoiling from his methods. Hatred did not automatically mean error to him. Condemnation did not automatically mean he had strayed. That is a rare and lethal disposition. In a soul of iron discipline, it can look like strength. In a soul drawn toward the wrong design, it can become the road to damnation walked without hesitation. So when we look back upon the Great Crusade and seek the first shape of the hydra within it, we should not search for obvious corruption in the early shadows. We should look instead for a Primarch already prepared to disappear inside necessity, a commander already accustomed to being misread, a son of the Emperor who could do his work without needing to resemble the noble image of that work. In another age, such a nature might have made him indispensable and nothing more. But in the age that came, when every certainty was baited and every oath fed the warp with consequence, it made him vulnerable to the most ruinous question of all. What if the Emperor created one son who could only ever serve by becoming impossible to trust? And what if that son was strong enough to become hated without at once believing himself lost? This chapter must be approached with care, because here the ground beneath us is ash and broken glass rather than stone. This is not hard proof. It is not a sealed edict broken from a vault beneath the imperial palace. It is not a confession laid blood-warm upon a strategium table. It is pressure. It is implication. It is the sort of thought that takes shape only when enough fragments of forbidden testimony are held together in shaking hands and viewed against the corpse light of the age. In the matter of the Emperor's foreknowledge, in the matter of whether some form of internal war was anticipated long before Horus tore the Imperium open, certainty is a luxury no honest student of this darkness can claim. The best one can do is stare into the crack and decide whether it is merely shadow or the outline of something staring back. There are whispers preserved in sanctioned account and half-trusted recollection alike. Words attributed to Malcador the Sigillite, Regent of Terror, Lord of Hidden Councils and Keeper of Burdens, no sane man would willingly bear. These revelations do not arrive clean. They never could. They come wrapped in the old poison of imperial storytelling, where the summary itself all but warns the listener that certainty is not being offered, only a terrible possibility. Trust is uncertain. Even there, even in a telling meant to illuminate, the light does not fall evenly. That alone should tell us something. When the Sigillite is involved, when the Emperor's innermost design is even whispered at the edge of speech, truth is never handed over like a ration chit. It is rationed, veiled, arranged, protected from the listener, even as it is delivered to him. And what is the shape of that possibility? Not that the Emperor desired the Horus heresy exactly as it came to pass. That would be too simple, too obscene, too stupidly total in its cruelty, even for the old Lord of Mankind. No, the darker and perhaps more plausible thought is this: that he expected fracture, that he understood, at some level beyond ordinary human planning, that the Primarch project, the Great Crusade, the concentration of such monstrous power into 20 gene-forged suns and their vast legions, could not continue forever in one pure line of obedience. That some form of internal conflict may have been foreseen as a stage in the species' ascent, or as an unavoidable consequence of the tools he had chosen to wield. Not full rebellion, perhaps, not the warp-drenched apocalypse that followed, not the galaxy-splitting wound and 10,000 years of carrion empire, but conflict, purge, controlled fire, a civil war not of total ruin, but of terrible necessity. If so, then all things become more poisonous, because once you admit the possibility that the Emperor expected some manner of internal bloodletting, you must also admit that he may have believed he could master its scale, that he could contain it, direct it, use it as a forge uses flame, burning away weakness, consolidating power, reducing unstable elements, hardening the Imperium for the next stage of its monstrous becoming. That is the kind of thought which clings naturally to the Master of Mankind, because everything in his reign stank of instrumentality. Cities were built as engines. Faith was crushed to preserve reason. Then reason itself was shackled to preserve survival. Populations were moved as numbers, not souls. Whole worlds were pacified for the sake of a map. Entire cultures were erased because they obstructed a future no one living had been permitted to vote upon. Why then should suns be exempt from the same arithmetic? That is the truly bleak implication under all this ash. The Primarchs may have been tools first and suns second. The Imperium loves to tell itself stories of fatherhood because it makes the whole atrocity easier to bear. It is comforting to imagine tragic family drama, wounded love, jealousy, resentment, broken brotherhood, all the old noble ruin of epics retold 1,000,000 times by remembrancers and preachers alike. But the Emperor did not build a family. He built weapons that could command other weapons. He wrapped godlike ambition in flesh and called it lineage, because living beings obey that fiction more readily than they obey the truth. The Primarchs were beloved, perhaps, in whatever cold and distant manner the master of mankind was capable of love. They were also deployed, directed, withheld, used. Their strengths were not accidents. Their flaws may not all have been accidents either. One was made to endure, one to command, one to build, one to destroy, one to terrify, one to charm, one to disappear into shadow and wage war where banners could not go. That son was Alpharius. If any Primarch would accept being used in a war behind the visible war, it was him. Not because he lacked conscience, but because his conscience was already trained to survive in conditions where appearances were worthless. He did not require the reassurance of public virtue. He did not need his wars to look clean from the outside. He had been shaped for infiltration, sabotage, and concealed causality. He already understood that the battlefield everyone sees is often only the shell of the real battlefield. Beneath the artillery, the drop assaults, the armoured thrusts and void duels, there are always hidden channels through which true victory flows. Information, timing, trust, subversion, delay, misdirection. A commander who lives in that underlayer of war is already only half a step removed from accepting that there may be another underlayer still. A war beneath the war. A design beneath the rebellion. A secret logic behind treason itself. So ask the question that matters. When Alpharius crossed the visible lines of loyalty, did he believe he was betraying the Emperor? Or did he believe he was enacting a harsher layer of the Emperor's own logic? That is not the same thing as innocence. Let no fool scramble toward redemption too quickly. A man can obey monstrous orders and still be monstrous. A son can enact a father's design and still become a butcher. The distinction matters not because it washes away blood, but because it changes the shape of the tragedy. If Alpharius acted from hatred, envy, or simple seduction into the creed of Horus, then his fall belongs beside the others in the old manner. Another bright ruin, another sun broken against his own defect. But if he acted because he believed a deeper command structure still held, because he believed visible betrayal was required by a more hidden obedience, then his path becomes something uniquely hideous. It becomes the road of the weapon that continues functioning long after the morality of its mission has collapsed. And that is why this chapter can only pressure the theory, not prove it. We do not possess the Emperor's thoughts as one might possess a weapon or a relic. We have no pure transcript of his will that escaped all manipulation. What we have are implications, suggestive fractures, sanctioned narratives that distrust themselves, Malkadorian murmurings that imply deeper preparation than the open histories admit, and a setting in which the most important truths are almost always those buried beneath 3 layers of contradiction. There is enough here to suspect foreknowledge of instability, enough to suspect the possibility of managed conflict envisioned in advance. Enough perhaps to imagine that certain sons may have been positioned with exactly such a hidden contingency in mind, but not enough to say the case is closed. Yet even this amount is devastating. Because if loyalty in the age of the Great Crusade was already poisoned by hidden contingencies, then the heresy did not begin with Horus at all. It began the moment obedience was severed from trust and rewired into function. It began the moment sons became assets inside scenarios they were never meant to see whole. It began the moment one could say, with a straight face and a dead conscience, that civil war might be acceptable, provided it remained useful. After that, the rot is only a matter of timing. Horus did not invent the poison. He may simply have torn open the cask and drowned the galaxy in what was already fermenting inside it. For Alpharius, this matters more than for any other brother, because he is the Primarch least dependent on moral clarity as a precondition for action. Another son, told to commit some hidden evil in service to a larger good, might break upon the contradiction. He might rebel in outrage, or refuse, or turn the order over and over in his mind until the stain became unbearable. Alpharius is not built that way. He is built for indirection. He is built to operate where certainty is absent and results must justify methods after the fact. He is therefore the ideal instrument for any hidden design and the ideal victim of any hidden design. If the Emperor anticipated some controlled fracture, Alpharius is exactly the kind of son who could be entrusted with playing the damned part. If a false vision was offered instead, by Xenos, by seers, by those who understood how to bait a systems thinker into atrocity, he is exactly the kind of son who might take that bait while still believing he served the broadest possible duty. Look how terrible that is. A Primarch not corrupted by appetite, nor lured by vanity, nor broken primarily by grievance, but led onward by duty itself. Duty cut loose from visible ethics. Duty reduced to outcome. Duty so abstracted that the murdered and the betrayed become acceptable losses in a war only the planner believes he understands. That is a colder ruin than simple rebellion. It is rebellion that still speaks the language of service. It is treason that may sincerely imagine itself obedient. Such a thing is more dangerous than open heresy because it does not feel like sin from the inside. It feels like burden. It feels like necessary ugliness. It feels like being the only one grim enough to do what lesser souls would call unforgivable. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of all this. Perhaps the Emperor, if he did indeed foresee fracture, created sons whose very excellences ensured their destruction. The righteous would resist dirty necessity until they shattered. The proud would rage against instrumental use. The wounded would resent it. But Alpharius, the hidden blade, the architect of infiltration, the Primarch most accustomed to serving without applause and without trust, could step into that darkness and keep moving. He could be hated. He could be named deceiver. He could appear fallen to every witness who mattered and still tell himself that he had not ceased to obey, not because he was deluded in the ordinary sense, but because obedience in the Imperium was already a ruinous thing, bound not to goodness, but to design. So no, this is not proof that the Emperor planned the heresy as history received it. It is not proof that Alpharius knew the full shape of some secret civil war before the first open betrayal. But it is enough to force a more dreadful possibility upon us, that the line between service and betrayal was corrupted long before Istvan burned. That loyalty may already have been carrying poison in its blood during the bright years of the Crusade. That the sons of the Emperor were never all meant to stand forever in clean fraternal unity, and that some among them were built specifically to move through the necessary filth when unity failed. And once duty is severed from morality, once obedience is measured only by whether the plan survives and not by what the plan demands, Alpharius becomes the Primarch most likely to walk into damnation and still call it obedience. The cabal entered the shadow play of the heresy not as conquerors, nor as prophets bathed in the false sanctity the Imperium loves to drape over anyone who claims foresight, but as a Xenos conspiracy that claimed it had watched the war against chaos across ages longer than mankind's own climb from mud and murder. In the lore around the Alpha Legion, the Cabal is presented as an ancient coalition of alien intelligences and agents that sought out Alpharius and the 20th before the rebellion had fully burst into open flame, offering not fellowship, not worship, and not glory, but a vision of history itself as a trap closing shut. And what they offered was not temptation in the ordinary sense. They did not come bearing the lush poison that devoured Fulgrim. They did not come with the blunt sermon of wrath that swallowed Angron. They did not come with the gangrenous bitterness that curdled in Mortarian's lungs and soul. Theirs was a colder seduction, an arithmetic, a proposition so obscene that only a mind already trained to think beyond appearances could stomach hearing it to the end. The Cabal claimed there were only two roads out of the coming war. If the Emperor prevailed, mankind would endure, yes, but only as carrion stretched across millennia, preserved, long enough to feed the warp with unending fear, hatred, fanaticism, and decay until chaos consumed not merely humanity, but the galaxy entire. If Horus prevailed, mankind would be broken quickly, within a handful of generations, and by its own extinction, starve the dark gods of the great feast they were otherwise destined to enjoy. This was the hinge. This was the poisoned fulcrum. Preserve humanity and damn the galaxy in the long death. Destroy humanity and perhaps deny chaos its final banquet. For any other Primarch, such a vision might have sounded like the sort of delirium only Xenos witches and void-mad seers would dare present. To some, it would have provoked immediate slaughter. To others, it would have felt like blasphemy too absurd to survive more than a heartbeat. But Alpharius was not built like his brothers. He did not think in terms of visible honor. He did not begin with banners and only afterward consider consequence. He began with consequence. He began with systems, with the architecture beneath events, with chains of causality hidden under the marching feet of armies. He was the Primarch of the hidden war, of infiltration and severed command, of pressure applied not where it was seen, but where it would matter most. To such a mind, the Cabal's proposition would have landed not as temptation by appetite, but as a strategic problem of the widest possible scale. A choice between intolerable futures, a question of whether one species, even one's own, could be offered upon the altar if by that sacrifice the warp itself was denied its endless empire. That is why this moment matters more than almost any other, in understanding why Alpharius feels different from the rest of the traitor Primarchs. His supposed treason does not reek first of vanity, nor of pleasure, nor of the old and easy sins that make moral accounting simple for preachers. It reeks of the cold chamber, of charts laid beneath lumen glow, of one future weighed against another, while the blood of countless billions is treated as a quantity rather than a sacrament. The Cabal did not whisper to his ego. It whispered to his strategic mind. It did not ask him whether he wanted power. It asked him whether he could bear to become damned in memory if damnation was the price of defeating chaos in essence. Such an appeal is more terrible than common corruption because it leaves the victim feeling severe rather than indulgent, burdened rather than seduced. He does not feel he is descending. He feels he is accepting a burden weaker souls would refuse. And so the Alpha Legion becomes the perfect prey for this kind of lie, or this kind of truth, depending on how much faith one dares place in alien foresight. The 20th had always moved most effectively in ambiguity. It could wear false colors, speak with stolen voices, massacre one target to preserve another, and vanish into the static before the dead were cold enough to name their killers. If the galaxy had already been cornered, if the visible loyal path led only to 10,000 years of rot feeding the warp, then Alpharius was the one brother most psychologically equipped to ask whether open loyalty had itself become a trap. Not because he ceased to care for the Emperor's project, quite the opposite. Because he may have cared enough to contemplate saving it by destroying the Imperium's immediate future. Because he may have believed that the name of loyalty could survive, even if the appearance of loyalty had to be butchered and hung from the battlements as bait. Think on how horrifying that is. The choice the Cabal presents is no choice at all in the clean heroic sense. Every road leads into blood. Every answer is an atrocity. One path gives humanity a long twilight of shrines, wars, false gods, corpse piles, witch hunts, hive famines, and ceaseless agony while the warp fattens on the species like a bloated leech. The other path snuffs mankind out faster, turning the species into a sacrificial pyre in the hope that the fire consumes the gods feeding upon it. There is no noble line through such a vision, no gleaming road of honor untouched by massacre. Even hearing such a proposition is a contamination, because from that moment onward, every battle can be reinterpreted through monstrous necessity. Every dead world can be filed under required loss. Every brother can become expendable. The soul recoils, or it should. But Alpharius was not made for recoil. He was made to continue acting after recoil had become useless. This is why the Cabal's intervention sits at the center of Alpha Legion ambiguity. Without it, one can read the Legion's turn in more ordinary colors. With it, everything blackens and blurs. The Alpha Legion is specifically sought out and shown a cosmic scale equation in which visible betrayal may serve a deeper objective. That means the old categories begin to fail. If Alpharius chooses Horus after hearing the Cabal, he is not necessarily choosing Horus as father, champion, beloved commander, or ideological lord. He may instead be choosing the future in which Horus must win, so that something even worse fails to inherit the stars. He may be embracing the War Master, not out of personal devotion, but because history itself has been presented to him as a deadlocked snare, a siege in which both gates are poisoned, and only one poison ends the war before it becomes eternal. That is also why his treason feels unlike Fulgrim's gilded rot, unlike Angren's scream of butchered identity, unlike Mortarian's rancid endurance. Those are falls that still carry the texture of personality breaking under pressure, of flaws turned terminal by warp corruption and resentment. Alpharius's turn by this reading is not first a confession of weakness, it is a decision within a trap, a strategic submission to what appears to be the least terminal outcome. That does not make it less evil. It may make it more evil, because the man who falls to rage at least knows rage. The man who falls to pride at least understands the contours of the self he is serving. But the man who steps into treason because a prophecy convinced him that loyalty would doom existence itself becomes something colder than a rebel. He becomes an executioner acting in the name of a future none of the murdered will ever see. And consider too how perfectly such a proposition preys upon a Primarch already accustomed to being mistrusted. Alpharius did not require the love of his brothers in order to function. He could be whispered about in strategium halls, resented for his methods, scorned for victories that resembled sabotage more than conquest, and still continue toward the objective. The Cabal's choice, therefore, meets him on ground where his temperament is strongest and most vulnerable at once. It tells him that the galaxy may be saved only by becoming hated. It tells him that the correct move may be the one history will never forgive. It tells him that appearing damned might be the final service left to him. How many other Primarchs could bear that proposition without instantly breaking apart? How many could hear that they must become the visible traitor so that some hidden victory survives? Very few. Perhaps only the Hydra. Yet the chapter must remain honest. We are still staring through smoke. The Cabal could have lied. It could have misunderstood. Alien foresight is no clean lumen beam cast across the void. Prophecy in this setting is always a wound. Even later lore notes keep circling the same bleak point, that from some perspectives Horus still wins in a deeper sense, because the Emperor's survival on the Golden Throne does not end chaos, but merely prolongs the age in which chaos feeds. That does not prove the Cabal right. It only keeps the poison alive. It keeps the proposition plausible enough to remain deadly. And so, imagine Alpharius at the edge of that revelation, not as a melodramatic villain stroking some easy hunger for dominion, but as a Primarch built to solve impossible wars being shown the cruelest impossible war of all. Save mankind and damn the galaxy. Damn mankind and perhaps save the galaxy. Stand with the Emperor and feed chaos for ages. Stand with Horus and murder humanity before chaos can glut itself forever. The very language of loyalty collapses under such pressure. Duty becomes monstrous. Strategy becomes theology written in arterial spray. One no longer asks what is right in any human sense. One asks only which apocalypse is final and which can still be endured. That is the horror of the Cabal's choice. It does not make rebellion attractive. It makes obedience unbearable. It corners Alpharius not with lust or fury, but with the suggestion that every path already ends in a charnel field, and that the only remaining freedom is to choose which mountain of skulls the future will be built upon. A weaker or simpler soul might reject such arithmetic out of principle. A more open-hearted Primarch might call it blasphemy and cut the speaker down. But Alpharius was made for the hidden war, and the hidden war is where moral rot dresses itself in necessity and asks to be obeyed. That is why Alpharius became a traitor, if this reading holds. Not because he ceased to care, not because he stopped serving, but because he accepted a monstrous equation, and once he accepted it, treason ceased to look like betrayal and began to look like duty written in blood. Chondax is where the loyalist reading of Alpharius stops being a clever indulgence and starts becoming a blade that can actually cut. Before this point, one can still speak of hidden intentions in the broad language of theory. One can talk of poisoned prophecies, of strategic minds tempted by futures measured in extinction, of a Primarch built for veils and covert knives rather than banners and oaths cried aloud across the field. But Chondax is different. Chondax is not merely atmosphere. It is event. It is consequence. It is the place where the Alpha Legion's treason begins to act like sabotage against the traitor cause itself, and the old accusation becomes suddenly more difficult to hold in one hand without feeling it slip like blood. The white scars, far from the centers of imperial certainty, were already cut loose amid a barrage of contradictory messages and false reports, their place in the war unresolved until the last possible moment. The wider lore around the heresy even stresses how uncertain their allegiance seemed until the late turn of events forced the Khan to choose. Horus had every reason to want the 5th Legion secured before Terror called. Jagatai Khan was too dangerous to leave uncommitted, too swift, too independent, too difficult to predict, and too lethal if he chose the throne over the War Master. Such a force could not simply be ignored and hoped away. It had to be recruited, contained, deceived, delayed, or if necessity demanded, bled and broken before it could ride to the defense of the palace. The Chondax trap makes sense the moment one accepts that truth. The White Scars were isolated in a far-flung campaign, starved of reliable astropathic contact, and therefore vulnerable to manipulation. The Alpha Legion, acting under Horus's orders, was positioned to draw them into the Traitor coalition. Yet the record states with maddening clarity that they were meant to recruit the White Scars, not merely provoke them into hostile rupture. That distinction matters. It matters because what followed does not behave like simple obedience. Instead of a clean conversion, the Alpha Legion handled Chondax in a manner so baffling that even now the whole affair stinks of divided purpose. They gathered strength at the edge of the system. They refused clear communication. They maintained the cordon. They trapped the White Scars in uncertainty long enough for messages from the wider Imperium to begin clawing their way through the static. They seeded disinformation. They moved with visible hostility, and yet not with the ruthless decisiveness one would expect if the true objective was simply annihilation. When the moment came, their actions seemed designed less to force the Khan into Horus's embrace than to drive him into a state of suspicion, fury, and eventual escape. The result was not absorption. The result was crisis, confusion, and a narrow opening through which the White Scars could slip free and decide for themselves. That is not how one handles a prize target if one's loyalty to Horus is straightforward and unbroken. And at the black heart of that contradiction lies the pylon array. This is the point where the loyalist reading ceases to be decorative. The Chondax accounts preserve the claim that the White Scars had been kept blind and contained in part because an Alpha Legion held installation using Xeno's pylons or a similar nullifying mechanism had distorted or suppressed the astropathic pathways in the region. It was this that helped keep the Khan ignorant, suspended in a dead zone of static and lies, while the wider galaxy was already beginning to drown in fratricide. Then Omegon, or forces acting under his hidden will, dispatched a mission to destroy that same installation. The justification given within the record may itself be another mask, another lie layered over older lies, but the consequence is brutally simple. Once the facility was destroyed, the communications curtain faltered. Word from Rogel Dawn got through. Horus's treachery was no longer something held at the edge of rumor. It became a warning the Khan could hear, and once he heard it, the path to terror reopened. That single consequence should haunt every easy reading of the Alpha Legion. Because if they were merely Horus's obedient servants, the destruction of that array makes far less sense than preserving it. If their aim was only to deliver the White Scars into the Traitor fold, then allowing loyalist warnings to pierce the fog was an act of strategic self-mutilation. If their task was to neutralize the Khan before he could reinforce terror, then opening the channel through which terror called for aid was the precise opposite of sound Traitor policy. One can wriggle, of course. One can say the Alpha Legion simply miscalculated, or that internal dysfunction and arrogance produced accidental failure, or that conflicting reports make all such conclusions hazardous. But the larger pattern remains. The White Scars did get the warning. The Khan did return to the Emperor's side, and the lore around Chondax itself presents that opening as tied directly to Omegon's destruction of the communications choking pylon site. So speak the argument plainly. What happened at Chondax looks very much like hidden sabotage carried out beneath the cover of apparent treason. Not open rebellion against Horus within the traitor camp. Not some heroic declaration. Not a dramatic reveal of concealed virtue, but something more fitting to the hydra and therefore far worse. It looks like a legion willing to wear the face of the enemy while inflicting carefully measured wounds upon that enemy's wider design. It looks like Alpharius and Omegon, or one of them against the other, or one hidden current within the legion acting through a wider current of declared rebellion, judged that the white scars must not be handed cleanly to Horus. So they delayed, deceived, provoked, contained, and finally opened just enough of the veil for the Khan to choose terror. That is not redemption. It is covert triage performed with blood-covered hands. The Alpha Legion did not suddenly become merciful at Chondax. It continued murdering, infiltrating, and lying. It simply appears to have done so in a way that wounded the traitor cause at the decisive point. This is exactly why the Legion is impossible to classify, even in universe, even to those who fought it and watched brother slay brother in void war and on the dust of ruined worlds. Simple Traitor Legion does not keep producing outcomes that seem to help the throne at critical moments. A simple Loyalist Legion does not conduct itself with such utter disregard for loyal lives, truth, and coherent allegiance. The Alpha Legion gives both verdicts enough meat to feed upon and then poisons the feast. It blockades the white scars and then helps them receive loyalist warning. It attacks and delays, yet also opens the route by which terror gains one of its deadliest defenders. It acts in ways that make hatred easy and final judgment nearly impossible. This is not a weakness of the law. It is the entire point of the Legion's existence.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
The hydra was made to ensure that by the time you think you know which head bit you, the venom has already entered the blood. And if that is true at Chondax, then a darker interpretation opens beneath it. Alpharius may not have joined the traitor cause in order to help Horus win cleanly. He may have joined it in order to move inside it, to disappear into its command assumptions, to wound it from within at those moments when the war's decisive fulcrums revealed themselves. That would suit the Primarch built for the hidden war. It would suit the son who thinks in systems rather than declarations, in end states rather than public honor. It would suit the Legion that can commit atrocity in one theater while preserving a strategic possibility in another and call the whole pattern obedience to a larger necessity. Chondax then becomes not an embarrassing contradiction, but a glimpse of method. The white scars were too important to surrender, so the Alpha Legion wrapped preservation in hostility, turned salvation into ambush, and made the Khan's return to terror look like escape from traitor coils, rather than delivery by hidden hands. There is a cruelty to that interpretation, which should not be missed. Because even if Alpharius or Omegon acted here in a manner that ultimately served terror, they did not do so with clean hands or transparent intent. White scars still died in the trap. Ships still burned in silence under cold stars. False messages still gnawed at trust. Men still bled out in corridor breaches, while void shields flickered and vox channels spat treachery in familiar voices. The Alpha Legion did not save the Khan by revealing itself as ally. It saved the possibility of his loyalty through methods so malign that the rescue itself felt like another treason. That is the most hydra thing imaginable: to aid by poisoning, to preserve by attacking, to serve by ensuring that the one served will never thank you and may never even know what was done. That is why Chondax matters so much. It is the point where the thesis ceases to be merely philosophical and becomes operational. The Alpha Legion did not stop being dangerous when it turned. It became more dangerous because its loyalty was no longer visible. Pluto is where the theory blackens. Up until this point, one can still speak of Alpharius in the language of shadows and contingencies. one can still pretend there is room to breathe inside the riddle. The cabal poisons the well. Chondax opens a wound in the traitor narrative. The hidden war offers just enough room for interpretation that some larger logic might still be stalking behind the visible crimes. But Pluto is different. Pluto is where ambiguity hits iron. It is where the hydra, so often content to kill by proxy and vanish into sabotage, stands in the open under the dead light of the outer system and pays in Primarch blood. This is not merely another covert operation gone unread by lesser minds. This is the moment where secrecy collides with mortality, and the result is not clarity, but something fouler. Because when Alpharius falls, the mystery does not die with him. It metastasizes. The Battle of Pluto was no minor raid. It was one of the opening thrusts of the Solar War, a spear point aimed at the gate of the throne world itself. Alpharius led the strike into the Sol system and on the fortress moon, Hydra. The Alpha Legion revealed what it had always been designed to do at the highest imaginable scale: sabotage, infiltration, false channels, hidden preparations, coordinated disorder spreading ahead of the blade. This was not a berserk assault in the manner of Angron's butchers, nor the grand theatrical cruelty of Kurz's sons. It was an intrusion shaped like inevitability. The hidden war dragged all the way to the threshold of terror. And at the center of it stood Alpharius himself, no longer merely the rumor moving behind events, but the Primarch in the flesh, closing his hand around one of the last gates before the Imperial Palace. Then came dawn. There is something almost obscene in how fitting that duel is. Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of walls, of certainty, of visible duty, of stone-like truth. Alpharius, the Primarch of masks, of veils, of redirected lines of force, of truth treated as another battlefield to be mined and trapped. If the heresy is a war of brothers, then Pluto gives us one of its purest collisions of opposing natures. And the lore around the battle gives the scene a venomous edge that should not be ignored, because Alpharius, in the surviving account, does not frame his actions as service to Horus in the blunt sense. He appeals instead to the future. He urges Dawn to understand, to help him achieve what he casts as a truer victory. Dawn refuses. He does not debate the philosophy. He does not descend into the Hydra's maze. He answers with violence. He steps into the strike meant to kill him, traps Alpharius in the commitment of the blow, and then destroys him with terrifying finality. Hands severed, chest opened, his own spear turned against him, chainsword teeth through the skull. It is one of the most brutal and symbolically perfect deaths in the heresy, because certainty does not refute ambiguity with words. It hacks it apart. And yet even here, even in the act of death, the Alpha Legion refuses to become simple. Because Dawn does not trumpet the slaying to the heavens. He does not make a shrine of the victory. He does not let the Sol system feast on the public proof that one of Horus's brothers has been struck down at the gate. Instead, he suppresses broad acknowledgement of both Alpharius's presence and Alpharius's death, restricting knowledge, elevating those who directly witnessed it, and denying the Hydra the open theatre of martyrdom or legend. Officially, this can be read as contempt. Dawn sought to give Alpharius no honour, no public monument, no grand remembrance to feed the myth. But the result is far stranger than the intent. By concealing the death, Dawn does not kill the story. He deepens it. He drives the blade in and leaves the wound sealed over on the surface, where it can fester in rumour for millennia. A Primarch slain in secret is never just dead. He becomes an echo, a possibility, a ghost name waiting to be worn again. And far away, beyond. The immediate red ruin of Pluto, Omegon feels it. That detail matters more than almost anything else in the entire Hydra myth. Distantly, Omegon registers the death of his brother. The lore is plain on that point, even while everything around it remains poisoned by layers of deception. One twin dies, the other knows. The Alpha Legion, built from the beginning around interchangeable identity, around mirrored command, around the blasphemous practicality of one soul in two bodies and one name spread across many mouths, suddenly loses half of itself in an instant. Imagine what that means inside such a structure. Not merely the death of a commander, not merely the loss of a Primarch in the military sense, the loss of a mirror, the loss of confirmation, the loss of the one being in the galaxy who fully understood the burden of the mask because he wore the other side of it. A legion founded on substitution can survive the death of one of its heads. A legion founded on shared identity can never survive it cleanly. Something spiritual tears when that happens. Something that cannot be rebuilt by doctrine, by discipline, or by another officer stepping into command. And this is where the chapter becomes poisonous. Which twin dies? Which twin carries the burden after Pluto? Which twin had leaned further into the cabal's arithmetic? Which had held more tightly to any hidden loyal purpose that still survived beneath the Legion's treason? Which had spoken to dawn on Hydra? Which had kept back some fragment of the old allegiance under all the lies? Which one is gone when Storm's teeth finishes its work? The lore gives us enough to know that a death occurred, and that Omegon took the name afterward. It does not give us the clean comfort of total certainty about what that means for the soul of the Legion thereafter. One can make arguments. One can say the brother slain on Pluto was the one most committed to the hidden loyal burden, leaving the survivor to inherit a mask, but not the same conscience. Or one can say the dead twin was the harder traitor, and the one who remained continued some secret design under a name now made even darker by martyrdom. Both readings are possible. Neither can be sealed shut beyond dispute. That uncertainty is not a gap in the Hydra's story. It is the Hydra's final method. So after Pluto, every act attributed to Alpharius becomes automatically more suspect than before. Not less. More. Because before Pluto, at least in theory, there were still two living Primarchs sharing the burden of one public identity. However diseased that arrangement was, it retained an internal symmetry. After Pluto, the symmetry breaks. The surviving twin assumes the mantle fully. The name persists. The Hydra keeps speaking. Alpharius can still appear. Alpharius can still advise Horus, still move among the traitor command, still remain a knife in the dark history cannot pin to one corpse. But now every such appearance is haunted by absence. The name continues, yet half the being behind it is gone. From that moment onward, when some source claims Alpharius acted here or there, what it really tells us is only that the mask survived. It does not tell us who, in the deepest sense, was wearing it from within. That changes everything. It means the strategy may continue while the soul behind the strategy has altered. It means the old calculations may still be enacted by a mind carrying grief severe enough to deform them. It means that if Alpharius had indeed entered treason as camouflage for a larger service, Pluto may be the moment that camouflage becomes permanent spiritual ruin. A role can be worn for a time, a mask can be put on and later removed. But when one brother dies and the other takes his name forever, the role stops being temporary deception and starts becoming ontology. The disguise eats the face beneath it. The covert logic that may once have been bounded by twin accountability is now left to a single surviving will, one sharpened by bereavement, and cut loose from the only equal who could have checked it. From there, it is only a short slide into a darkness where loyalty and treason are no longer merely hard to distinguish, but perhaps no longer distinct inside the mind carrying them. This is why Pluto is darker than Chondax. Chondax suggests hidden sabotage in service to terror. Pluto suggests the death of the very structure that might have kept such sabotage tethered to any coherent moral end. Whatever game the twins were playing before, one of the players is gone after Hydra. The surviving brother inherits not only command, but grief, myth, silence, and the terrible utility of a name the galaxy now cannot verify. That is not merely an operational shift. It is a corruption of identity itself. The Legion of Many Faces loses half of its true face and responds not by mourning openly, not by clarifying, not by retreating into singular truth, but by tightening the mask and continuing the war. And this is where the theory becomes almost unbearable. If Alpharius had joined the traitor cause in order to wound it from within, if he had accepted infamy as the cost of some harsher loyalty, then Pluto may be the moment that mission becomes impossible to disentangle from self-destruction. The brother who remains must carry two burdens at once: the practical burden of continuing the Legion's plans, and the emotional burden of becoming his dead twin in full. What happens to loyalty under that kind of pressure? What happens to secret purpose when it has to survive inside bereavement, rage, and absolute uncertainty? Does it harden? Does it curdle? Does it simply continue moving because movement is all the Hydra has ever known? The law does not let us answer cleanly. It only gives us the corpse, the concealment, the distant psychic shudder, and the assumption of the name. The rest is aftermath, and aftermath is where truth goes to rot in this universe. So remember Pluto for what it is. Not merely the battle where Dawn seemingly killed Alpharius. Not merely a glorious loyalist victory carved in Chainsword teeth. It is the place where the Alpha Legion's grand strategic masquerade may have crossed the line into something permanent and spiritually unrecoverable. One brother falls. One brother rises wearing the fallen brother's name. Dawn buries the truth instead of displaying it. The Legion keeps moving. Horus still hears from Alpharius. The galaxy still sees the Hydra. But from that point onward, nobody can say with full honesty which loyalty, which intention, which fragment of the old design truly survived the blade. One brother dead, one brother wearing his name, and the galaxy, then and forever after, never knowing which loyalty walked away from Pluto alive. Omegon takes up the mantle of Alpharius after Pluto, and with that single act, the Alpha Legion ceases to be merely secretive and becomes something far worse. This is not the passing of a crown from one brow to another. It is not the orderly succession of a dead commander by his surviving kin. The surviving twin senses the death of his brother, then assumes the fallen name when Horus demands to speak with Alpharius, and that sequence tells us everything rotten about what follows. The Hydra does not mourn in the open. It does not halt. It does not clarify. It simply closes one wound by turning it into a lie the galaxy will have to live inside. That is why Pluto does not end the mystery. It annihilates certainty instead. Before the battle, one could at least imagine a terrible symmetry. Two Primarchs, one public identity, one vast legion trained to move through mirrors, substitutions, and buried command structures. Diseased as that arrangement already was, it still possessed an internal balance. One brother could check the other. One hidden intention could be tested against another hidden intention. Even if the rest of the Imperium never knew which head of the Hydra was speaking, the Hydra still knew itself. After Pluto, that inner balance is gone. The name remains, the armor remains, the command phrases remain, the war remains. But the being behind the mask is no longer twofold. From that moment onward, every appearance of Alpharius is not just deception directed outward, it is also a wound carried inward. And so the question changes. Before Pluto, men ask whether Alpharius was loyal. After Pluto, that is no longer quite the right question. The question becomes what the surviving twin decided loyalty now meant. That shift is more dangerous than it first appears. Loyalty can be anchored to a throne, to a father, to a cause, to a species, to an oath, to a brother, or simply to the machinery of a plan already set in motion. Once one twin dies and the other takes his name, all those anchors begin to slide against one another. Does the survivor remain loyal to the Emperor, if that loyalty had ever truly endured beneath the visible treason? Does he remain loyal to some old design born before Pluto and now impossible to complete as intended? Does loyalty narrow itself to the Legion alone, to the preservation of the hydra as organism and creed? Or does it degrade further still, until what remains is only loyalty to the dead brother's work, or to the mere continuation of movement, because stopping would force the truth into the light? This is where tragedy overtakes intention. A hidden mission, even one conceived in the harshest necessity, depends upon more than secrecy. It depends upon internal coherence. It depends upon a mind or minds still capable of remembering why the damnable thing was undertaken in the first place. Break the architects, and the architecture remains without a soul fit to inhabit it. That is the horror hanging over Omegon after Pluto. Even if one grants the most sympathetic possible reading, even if one imagines that Alpharius and Omegon had entered the traitor stream to wound it from within or to serve some larger anti-chaos calculus, the death of one twin threatens to rot that mission at the root. Secret wars do not survive trauma cleanly. Plans written in duplicity become feverish when grief gets hold of them. The objective survives on parchment and in memory, but its moral center can die with the one who helped define it. So picture Omegon not as a triumphant inheritor, but as something more blighted. He is grief wrapped in scale armor. He is secrecy carrying a corpse inside it. He is a dead identity made animate again by necessity. The galaxy still hears the name Alpharius, but now that name is inhabited by a survivor who has lost the only being who could fully understand what it meant to wear it. That kind of bereavement is unlike common mourning. This is not the sorrow of a Primarch losing a favored son, nor even the rage of a brother avenging a brother. This is the collapse of a mirrored self. A legion built on interchangeability suddenly discovers that interchangeability was never the same as replacement. Omegon can become Alpharius in public function, yes. He can take the mantle, speak with the old authority, stand before traitor councils beneath the old name, but he cannot restore the symmetry that made the mask livable. And once that symmetry is gone, whatever higher cause once justified Alpha Legion duplicity becomes harder to distinguish from obsession. This is the point that should make every serious reading of the Hydra turn cold. Before Pluto, one might still imagine strategy disciplined by dual perspective. After Pluto, what remains may no longer be pure strategy at all. It may be grief ritualized as doctrine. It may be the refusal to abandon a brother's path because abandoning it would mean admitting that all the blood already spilled purchased nothing but ash. It may be loyalty to a dead twin, elevated above loyalty to Emperor, Imperium, or mankind. Or perhaps it is even worse than that. Perhaps it is simply momentum, the monstrous inertia of a covert, war machine too deep in falsehood to emerge without being torn apart. At that stage, the old language of mission becomes difficult to separate from compulsion. That is why the Alpha Legion after Pluto feels spiritually unmoored. Not just covert, not just elusive, unmoored. A hidden hand can still be purposeful. A masked commander can still know who he is beneath the helm. But Omegan inheriting Alpharius does not merely preserve deception as a tactic. It corrodes identity as a stable thing. The Legion keeps fighting. The name keeps appearing. The war rolls onward into the greater cataclysm. Yet all of it now unfolds under a condition of interior fracture. One can no longer say with confidence that the man wearing the mask serves the same hierarchy of loyalties that existed before Pluto. The outward pattern may continue, but the inward meaning has shifted beyond reliable recovery. In that sense, the Alpha Legion does not merely operate in the shadows after Pluto, it drowns there. This is also where the title of the whole argument deepens into something uglier. It is not just a question of why Alpharius became a traitor, it is a question of why the mask could never come off afterward. Once Omegon assumes the name, the treason ceases to be a temporary appearance that might one day be shed. It becomes historical reality, strategic necessity, emotional prison, and surviving identity all at once. To remove the mask would be to expose too many layers of rot. It would mean admitting the twins' secret in full. It would mean explaining Pluto. It would mean clarifying past operations that only made sense while concealed. It would mean facing the possibility that the surviving brother no longer knows where the old mission ended and his own grief began. Far easier and far more fatal to remain Alpharius forever and let history condemn the role while the wearer disappears inside it. There is a reason later sightings and claims around Alpharius feel so diseased in the lore. The name persists in ways that make even the traitors uneasy. The hydra still speaks. The hydra still strikes. The hydra still seems to stand apart from full surrender to obvious chaos degradation, even while remaining irredeemably hostile, duplicitous, and blood-soaked. That persistence does not resolve the mystery. It confirms the damage. A living Primarch identity continues, but under conditions where nobody can be fully sure what remains of the original moral intent behind it. The Legion can still carry out sophisticated campaigns. It can still prove its worth against enemy legions and continue the long war under the old symbol. Yet every such act now bears the stain of inheritance after rupture. The continuity is real, but so is the distortion. And this is the true abyss beneath Omegon's inheritance. A secret mission can survive the death of one who conceived it. Orders can remain. Caches can remain. Embedded operatives can remain. Triggers can remain buried in the flesh of worlds. For years before activation, covert structures are built for this kind of endurance. That is why the Alpha Legion is so dangerous. It can keep moving after decapitation because it was designed to make command diffuse and identity flexible. But a secret conscience is another matter entirely. The private moral logic that tells a commander why he may commit unspeakable acts in service to some greater necessity is fragile in a way operations are not. Kill one half of the twin soul that held such logic in balance, and the conscience that guided the mission may not survive in recognizable form. The plan lives. The justifying soul does not necessarily live with it. So when we speak of Omegon inheriting the mask, we should not picture succession. We should picture possession. One brother dead on Pluto beneath Dawn's wrath. One brother hearing that death across the void like a blade passing through his own hidden organs. One brother stepping into the dead name because the war demands it and because the Legion cannot function otherwise. From that point onward, loyalty itself is dragged through a meat grinder of grief, secrecy, and self-erasure. The Hydra still has a head. The galaxy still has a traitor named Alpharius. But the thing inside that name is no longer what it was before Hydra's halls ran slick with Primarch blood. A secret mission may survive a death. A secret conscience often cannot. Let no one make the mistake of washing the Alpha Legion clean merely because one can imagine a hidden current of loyalty somewhere beneath its treasons. That temptation is for fools, for weak-minded chroniclers who still crave a moral structure simple enough to survive in this age. A loyalist reading does not redeem the Hydra. It does not lift one flake of ash from the dead, or close one torn throat, or restore one regiment butchered by lies fed through stolen Vox channels. Even if Alpharius, or Omegon, or both, entered the heresy under some harsher conviction of service, the methods of the 20th remain methods of contamination. They remain methods of infiltration, false sigils, sabotaged command chains, implanted agents, disguised identities, and confusion sharpened until confusion itself becomes a weapon more reliable than any bolter. To imagine secret loyalty inside such a machine is not to discover hidden nobility. It is to discover how damnation can wear the face of purpose and still leave the galaxy choking on blood. That is the essential horror of the Legion after the break. The Alpha Legion does not wage war in the open language most armies still understand. It does not merely attack fortifications or break battle lines through force of arms. It takes hold of identity itself and turns it inside out. A captain receives a code authenticated by voices he trusts and marches his men into slaughter. A governor purges the wrong district because an operative has fed him evidence built from truths arranged in the service of a lie. A battle group changes course because an astropathic warning arrives with the proper sanctified sigils, only to find itself adrift inside a kill box prepared months in advance. A warrior turns on the brother at his shoulder because the brother's order sounds subtly wrong, and by the time doubt flowers, chainblade teeth have already gone screaming through gorget seals and into the meat beneath. This is not war conducted against armies alone. It is war conducted against certainty, against recognition, against the basic trust required for any human structure to remain coherent under pressure. And once the heresy burns away the last hope of central control, once the old unity of purpose dies beneath fratricide, loss, secrecy, and the long corrosion of the warp age, such a legion is almost guaranteed to fragment into contradictory cells. How could it do otherwise? The Alpha Legion had already normalized compartmentalization before the Civil War reached its full putrescence. It already believed in hidden chains of command, in missions known only by fragments, in operatives cut off from the larger design because ignorance itself preserved the greater operation. That kind of military organism is terrifyingly resilient while the central intelligence guiding it remains whole. But the instant that guiding intelligence is damaged, split, or buried beneath irreconcilable goals, the same strengths become diseases. Cells continue executing old directives stripped of context. Warbands inherit caches, commands, and kill protocols without inheriting the full moral or strategic rationale that once held them together. Some keep moving in the name of plans no living commander any longer understands. Others reinterpret the old symbols to suit local necessity, vengeance, or delusion. The Hydra survives decapitation by growing more heads, and every head is convinced it remembers the body correctly. This is where intention and consequence finally divorce beyond repair. Perhaps one cell tells itself it is still waging a hidden war against chaos, using traitor forms and outlaw methods, only because the visible Imperium has become too blinded by dogma to recognize true service. Perhaps another insists it fights tyranny in all forms, imperial or heretical alike, and that every governor slain, every shrine world destabilized, every naval code broken, is part of a deeper cleansing of corruption. Perhaps another preserves a ritual hatred of the warp while conducting covert operations alongside forces visibly swollen with mutation and demonic favor, because strategy, it says, demands temporary contamination. The slogans differ, the self-image differs. The old justifications mutate from cell to cell, like an infection taking different forms in different organs. Yet on the ground, the outcomes become indistinguishable from treason. Populations die, trust collapses, loyal worlds burn, supply lines fail, astropathic choirs are butchered in their sanctums. Fortress monasteries go to war against allies because the data fed into their threat calculations has been changed by one ghost hand moving beneath the machine spirit's prayers. Whatever those warbands tell themselves, they leave behind the same spore as apostasy. That is why any possible loyalty in Alpharius is tragic rather than comforting. It does not save anyone from what the Legion becomes. This is the point too many readers flinch away from, because it robs the theory of all easy pleasure. The thought that Alpharius may have entered treason under a higher logic is compelling precisely because it makes the story more bitter, not less. It means a hidden intention may have existed and still produced a legacy indistinguishable from nightmare. It means secret service, if it was ever there at all, curdled in the vessel meant to preserve it. It means that a Primarch could tell himself he acted for mankind, for the Emperor, for some anti-chaos calculus beyond ordinary morality, and still bequeath to the stars a legion that spreads paranoia, sabotage, and mass death wherever it slithers. This is the purest form of grim irony. The hydra may tell itself it serves salvation, even while it leaves worlds shrieking beneath the rubble of ruined hives, and void stations drifting dark with their crews flensed by their own supposed rescuers. And there is no shortage of meat in the long war to prove how such a thing unfolds. A covert order arrives, and 1 million workers in a manufacturum hive are starved because cargo routes have been discreetly rerouted to punish a governor who never learns why his world is dying. A chapter serf on a loyal station is replaced years before an attack, and when the hour comes, he vents a launch bay into vacuum and sends a company of battle brothers tumbling into the void without ever revealing his true allegiance. A shrine city falls not because the enemy was stronger, but because its defenders no longer trust one another enough to hold a firing line when the alarms scream. Men open one another from collarbone to groin, in corridors clogged with incense smoke, because a phrase used at the wrong time has turned every brother into a suspect. Brains paste cogitator banks. Guts coil steaming across deck plates. Blood slicks chapel steps, where the icon of the Emperor still stares down in gilded silence, while hidden operatives walk among the slaughter, wearing the colours of the dead. If this is loyalty, then it is a loyalty no victim can distinguish from evil, and that distinction matters. Because in this universe, outcome always rots faster than intention. A commander may begin by sacrificing a city to save a sector, then a sector to preserve a crusade route, then a crusade route to preserve some future alignment of forces only he can still perceive beneath the static. At each stage, the justification grows colder and the bodies grow warmer. victory decays into ash. Every strategic success mutates into a deeper loss. A traitor fleet is delayed, but the method used to delay it creates another generation of embittered survivors who will feed rebellion later. A key world is preserved, but only by turning its institutions inward upon themselves so completely that it emerges from salvation as a paranoid ruin ready to devour its own sons. An enemy advance is blunted by false intelligence, yet the same campaign shatters trust between Imperial commands so thoroughly that the larger defensive structure never fully heals. This is the wider grimdark pattern. Nothing stays saved. Nothing remains pure. Every tactical brilliance leaves a poisoned seed in the corpse soil. That is why the Alpha Legion remains so compelling even now, after so much of the galaxy has been buried beneath the weight of its lies. It refuses singular classification. It is loyal and traitor, useful and ruinous, disciplined and fragmented, anti-chaos in rhetoric and chaos adjacent in consequence, rational in self-image and monstrous in practice. Few forces in this setting embody contradiction so completely without collapsing into incoherence. The Hydra is coherent precisely because contradiction is its native climate. Other legions fall and become one thing. They become berserkers, plague-bearers in all but name, decadent killers, blind zealots, carrion kings stalking the ruins of old vows. The Alpha Legion falls sideways. It enters ruin through ambiguity. It continues speaking in the language of objectives, end states, and necessity, long after the moral ground beneath those words has collapsed. That makes it more frightening than the merely damned. The damned often know what they are. The Hydra may still be telling itself a story about purpose, while its blades work exactly the same red miracles as any other traitor. And somewhere beneath all of this lingers the last cruel question. Even if one grants that Alpharius, or Omegon, or some hidden current of the Legion, truly sought to wound Horus, preserve terror, or deny chaos a final dominion, what does that matter once the inherited machinery of deception has begun reproducing itself without a stable conscience to guide it? A secret war can outlive the reason it was begun. A false identity can outlive the soul that first wore it strategically. A covert doctrine can perpetuate itself through habit, pride, and institutional momentum until it no longer protects any higher objective at all. It simply continues because continuation is what it was built to do. That is the fate hanging over the Legion in the long aftermath. Not dramatic corruption into obvious demon worship alone, though some among them no doubt take that path. Something colder. The reduction of grand purpose into self-sustaining clandestine violence. The ritual continuation of a mission whose heart has already rotted away. So no, the Alpha Legion does not escape corruption by hiding from chaos. It simply finds a colder route into ruin. It trades the screaming dissent of other traitors for a quieter damnation, one measured in compartmentalized wars, fractured loyalties, and justifications whispered over mountains of dead who never knew why they were chosen. That is why the possibility of Alpharius's loyalty is not a lantern in the dark. It is another darkness layered beneath the first. It tells us that even genuine service, once severed from visible morality and entrusted to a machine built from deception, can become indistinguishable from the very evil it sought to outmaneuver. The Hydra survives. The Hydra adapts. The Hydra keeps striking. But whatever spark of duty may once have lived inside it does not spare the galaxy one drop of blood. The title was a lie only because the truth beneath it was uglier than the title itself could bear. To say Alpharius became a traitor is correct in the way all imperial verdicts are correct when they have already decided what shape truth must take before the evidence is even laid out upon the altar. He stood with Horus in history. He fought the Imperium in symbol. He moved through the heresy in operational fact as one of the great enemies of the throne. The fleets burned. The loyal died. The hydra struck from darkness and left worlds choking on their own broken command structures. In every visible sense that matters to archivists, preachers, and executioners, Alpharius was a traitor. Yet that may still fail to reach the deepest level of allegiance that drove him, because with the Alpha Legion, the outward act and the inward objective do not march in the same formation. They stalk one another through fog, and by the time the gunfire starts, they are no longer easy to tell apart. That is the final verdict, and it is not a comfortable one. Alpharius became a traitor historically, symbolically, and operationally, but not necessarily in the deepest sense of intended allegiance. That does not save him. It condemns him more completely. A common rebel breaks faith because he wants something: power, vengeance, freedom, worship, dominion. A Primarch who breaks faith because he believes loyalty itself now demands betrayal enters a colder ruin than any of these. He has not ceased serving. He has instead severed service from every moral signpost that would have told a lesser soul to halt. Once that severing occurs, the road into damnation opens so wide that even a son of the Emperor can mistake it for duty. The cabal is the poisoned hinge on which that whole possibility turns. It approached Alpharius and the Alpha Legion before the open rebellion had fully consumed the Imperium, presenting itself as an ancient Xenos conspiracy that claimed to have long warred against the primordial annihilator and to possess a terrible foreknowledge of the coming age. Its proposition was not temptation in the vulgar sense. It did not ask Alpharius to kneel for pleasure, pride, or rage. It asked him to accept an equation so monstrous that only a mind already disciplined to think in system-wide consequence could bear to entertain it. If the Emperor won, mankind would endure only to feed chaos across long millennia of suffering. If Horus won, humanity would be broken swiftly, and the gods of the warp might be starved of their greatest feast. This is not the language of corruption by appetite. It is the language of strategic apocalypse. It asks whether loyalty to mankind might require betrayal of the Imperium that visibly carries mankind's banner. It asks whether a species can be offered up if by that sacrifice the galaxy escapes a worse eternity. That is the kind of venom that would find purchase in Alpharius precisely because he was built to think beyond banners and appearances. That does not prove the cabal right. It proves only that the framework it offered was ruinous enough to matter. If Alpharius accepted even part of it, then he did not join Horus because he loved Horus. He joined because he may have believed history itself had already become a siege with no clean gate left standing. In such a prison of futures visible, loyalty becomes suspect. Open obedience begins to look like participation in a longer defeat. The Hydra would be the legion most likely to step into that poison and call it necessity, because the Hydra had always been the legion least dependent on looking righteous while it worked. What other Primarch might reject as moral contamination, Alpharius could reinterpret as operational camouflage. What another brother would call damnation, he might call the final harsh price of service. That is not redemption. It is the deepest form of grimdark irony the setting can offer. Then comes Chondax, and theory begins to draw blood. The White Scars were isolated, their communications throttled, their allegiance uncertain, exactly the sort of force Horus could not afford to leave free if terror was ever to be strangled cleanly. The Alpha Legion was meant to recruit them, contain them, or neutralize them before they could return to the throne. Instead, the whole affair curdled into contradiction. The Alpha Legion handled the Fifth in a manner so maddeningly divided that even now the record reeks of buried purpose. Most crucially, the destruction of the station that had choked communication in the region opened the way for garbled warnings to reach Jagatai Khan, after which the Khan called his forces back and ultimately chose the Emperor's side. If the Alpha Legion were merely straightforward servants of Horus, this makes far less sense than preserving the trap and keeping the Khan blind. Chondax remains the strongest field evidence for the loyalist reading, not because it absolves the Hydra, but because it looks like hidden sabotage carried out beneath the cover of visible treason. Terror was aided, but aided by a knife that made the saving itself look like another ambush. And then Pluto takes whatever coherence remained and hacks it apart. Alpharius led the attack into the Sol system and met Rogel Dawn in direct collision at the very edge of the throne world's last defenses. There, according to the surviving accounts, Dawn killed him with brutal certainty. Yet even that death was denied the clean finality Imperial history normally craves. Dawn suppressed broad acknowledgement of Alpharius's presence and his death, denying the Hydra public martyrdom, and in so doing deepening the myth beyond repair. Far away, Omegon sensed the death of his twin. Soon after, the surviving brother took up the name of Alpharius when the War Master demanded answers. From that instant onward, the question could never again be cleanly recovered. One twin dead, one twin wearing the dead name. Every later appearance of Alpharius haunted by absence, substitution, and grief. Whatever hidden loyal burden may once have existed now, had to survive inside a mask inherited through bereavement and war. That is why the truth cannot be recovered now except in shards. Before Pluto, the Hydra's deception was already murderous enough. After Pluto, it becomes metaphysical. Was the dead brother the one more committed to the cabal's equation, or the one resisting it? Was the surviving brother the carrier of the last secret loyalty, or only the keeper of momentum after conscience had already begun to rot? The law does not permit certainty. It gives us the death, the concealment, the distant psychic wound, and the assumption of the name. Everything after that must be read through smoke. That is not an accident. It is the final shape of Alpha Legion tragedy. Even the archive becomes another battlefield where the corpse continues fighting by denying historians the mercy of a stable answer. And so we return to the ugliest part of the argument. This reading does not brighten the setting, it darkens it. Alpharius may have remained loyal in intent and still doomed billions. The possibility of hidden service does not spare one throat from being cut in a corridor by a brother wearing the right colours and the wrong orders. It does not spare one hive from tearing itself apart under false directives slipped into its command lattice by unseen hands. It does not spare one fleet from mutiny, one city from purge, one chapel floor from becoming a red slick of brains and ruptured organs, while the machine spirits of the Vox arrays chant lies in holy code. If Alpharius believed he served a greater necessity, then the horror is precisely that his belief changes nothing for the dead. They are still dead. Their blood still clots black in the cracks of Ferrocrete. Their children still inherit worlds crippled by distrust and hidden war. Grimdark remains intact because the deepest loyalty, if it existed, was itself a weapon that killed like treason. That is the moral loop closing like a noose around the whole question. Alpharius's tragedy is not that he fell in the simple way the others fell. It is not merely that he was seduced, corrupted, maddened, or unmasked. It is that he may have damned himself while believing he had not fallen at all. He may have entered the role of traitor as one enters a sealed chamber full of poison, telling himself that survival of the species or starvation of chaos required him to breathe what would kill lesser men. That is a more terrible destiny than open apostasy. The apostate at least knows what altar he serves. Alpharius, by this reading, becomes the son who keeps serving while service itself is already diseased beyond recognition. He does not stop at the threshold of horror because horror has been recast as necessary burden. He does not hear the alarm as alarm. He hears it as confirmation that the cost is real. And that is why the Alpha Legion endures as one of the purest expressions of this universe's logic. In this age, loyalty is seldom measured by purity. Purity is for statues, for saints with no blood left in them, for cathedral glass lit from behind so that the cracks disappear at a distance. Real loyalty in this galaxy is measured by what horrors one is willing to commit in the name of a future no one present will live to see. The Imperium itself is built on that premise. Entire worlds are tithed into starvation so a war can continue somewhere else. Entire populations are fed into trench lines so another system may stand 1 week longer. The difference with Alpharius is only that he may have embraced this truth so completely that he no longer needed his service to resemble loyalty at all. He could wear the face of treason so long as the deeper equation remained, in his eyes, obedient. That is why he is more frightening than a simple rebel. He makes duty itself look like a corrupted sacrament. So the title is a lie one final time, because it is too small for the wound it tries to name. Alpharius did become a traitor. History records no softer verdict. Symbol and operation alike testify against him. Yet if the hydra carried even one hidden pulse of loyalty beneath all that blood, then the truth is not that he betrayed the emperor by ceasing to serve. The truth is far more poisonous. He may have believed he was still serving while every witness watched him drown in treason. That possibility cannot be cleaned up. It cannot be pinned into a sermon or sorted into the comfortable bins of hero, villain, martyr, or apostate. It leaves us exactly where the Alpha Legion has always wanted us, staring into a mask and wondering whether we are looking at a betrayer, a savior, a fool, a butcher, or some impossible union of all four. And with Alpharius, that uncertainty is not a failure of interpretation. It is the last successful operation of the Hydra itself. Alpharius did not become a traitor because he stopped serving. He became a traitor because service, in his eyes, demanded treason.